Have you ever walked into a room that used to feel like home and suddenly realized it doesn't anymore? Maybe nothing about the room has changed. The people are still there. The conversations are still happening. The expectations are still the same, but something inside you has changed. You can't quite go back to the way you used to be. Maybe you've outgrown the room. Welcome to Marble Magnolia with Dr. Regina Hernandez Smit. I'm Dr. Regina Hernandez Smit, and today we're talking about something that can be both liberating and deeply uncomfortable. What happens when you outgrow the room? Sometimes we think growth is supposed to feel exciting, and sometimes it does. We get the new opportunity, we learn something new, we meet new people, we accomplish something we've worked toward for years, and we celebrate. But there is another kind of growth, the kind that quietly changes your relationship with the places you've always known. The kind where you begin noticing things you didn't notice before. Patterns, conversations, expectations, dynamics. And suddenly, what once felt normal doesn't feel normal anymore. Not necessarily because everyone else changed, but because you did. And that's where things can get complicated. Because outgrowing something doesn't necessarily mean that something was bad. That's important. A room can have been good for you and still no longer be where you belong. A job can have taught you valuable lessons and still not be where you're meant to stay. A friendship can have been meaningful and still change. A community can have shaped you and still become too small for this person you're becoming. A community can have shaped you and still become too small for the person you're becoming. A version of yourself can have carried you through an entire season and still need to be released. Growth doesn't always require blame. Sometimes it simply requires honesty. I think women especially can struggle with this because we're often taught to value loyalty. And loyalty is beautiful, but loyalty without discernment can become self-abandonment. We stay because we've been there a long time. We stay because people are counting on us. We stay because leaving might disappoint someone. We stay because we remember what the relationship used to be. We stay because we don't want anyone to think we changed. But here's the truth. You are allowed to change. In fact, change is part of being alive. The question isn't whether you will change. The question is whether you will have the courage to acknowledge when you have. Sometimes you outgrow the room because you've developed new standards. Sometimes because you've developed new boundaries. Sometimes because you've discovered your voice. Sometimes because you've learned more. Sometimes because you've experienced something that changed you. And sometimes because God or life has simply moved you into a new season. Whatever the reason, the discomfort can be real. Because the room may still expect the old version of you, the version who said yes, the version who stayed quiet, the version who accommodated everyone, the version who didn't question things, the version who was always grateful just to have a seat at the table. But perhaps now you realize that having a seat isn't enough. You want to know what the table is being used for. That's growth. And this is where marble becomes important. Marble is the foundation. When you outgrow a room, you need something inside you that remains steady. Because leaving one room without knowing what you stand for can simply lead you into another room that doesn't fit. Growth isn't just about moving away from something. It's about moving towards something. So ask yourself, what do I believe? What are my values? What standards am I no longer willing to compromise? What kind of leader do I want to be? What kind of woman am I becoming? What kind of life am I building? Those answers become your foundation. That's marble. Then there is magnolia. Magnolia is culture, and sometimes outgrowing a room means recognizing that culture matters. The people around you shape what feels normal. They shape what you tolerate. They shape what you believe is possible. They shape what you talk about. They shape how you treat people. They shape what you celebrate. And sometimes you don't realize how much a culture has influenced you until you step outside of it. That's why choosing your rooms matters. Choose environments where integrity is normal, where excellence is encouraged, where people can disagree without destroying one another, where boundaries are respected, where generosity isn't weakness, where leadership isn't about control, where people don't have to make themselves smaller so someone else can feel bigger. That is culture. That's magnolia. And then there is marigold, presence, the part of you that has finally learned, I am allowed to take up space, not because you're better than anyone else, not because you're entitled to anything, but because you belong in the room too. And sometimes marigold means realizing that the room you need isn't one you have to wait to be invited to. Maybe you have to help create it. Maybe you have to build it. Maybe you have to become the person who opens the door for someone else. Maybe your next chapter isn't about finding the right room. Maybe it's about creating one. That can be frightening, because when you're used to being part of someone else's structure, creating your own requires courage. There is no established script. No one else is telling you what to do. You have to decide what matters. You have to establish the culture. You have to set the boundaries. You have to set the standards. You have to invite the right people in. You have to be willing to say, this is what we're building here. That's leadership. But let's talk about something else. Sometimes you know you've outgrown a room before you're ready to leave it. And that's okay. You don't have to rush. You can learn. You can prepare. You can observe. You can save. You can finish what you started. You can make a thoughtful plan. Growth doesn't require impulsiveness. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is quietly prepare for your next season while honoring the season you're still in. You don't have to announce every change while it's happening. You don't have to tell everyone you're leaving before you know you're going. You don't have to prove that you're moving on. You can simply begin becoming. And eventually the next step becomes clear. Maybe it's a new job, a new business, a new community, a new relationship with yourself, a new way of leading, a new boundary, a new dream, or maybe it's simply the realization that you don't need to participate in every conversation anymore. Sometimes growth looks remarkably quiet. There's also grief in outgrowing a room. We don't talk about that enough, because even when something isn't right for you anymore, it can still hold memories. People you loved, lessons you needed, versions of yourself you are grateful for. You can be grateful for a room and still leave it. You can love people and still recognize that you are moving in different directions. You can honor your past without living there. That is not betrayal. That's maturity. So if you're listening today and you've been feeling uncomfortable somewhere in your life, I want you to ask yourself 3 questions. First, have I actually outgrown this room, or am I simply uncomfortable because I'm being challenged to grow within it? That's an important distinction. Second, does this environment support the person I'm becoming? Not the person I used to be, the person I'm becoming. And third, if I leave this room, what am I moving toward? Because growth isn't just about escape, it's about direction. Maybe you don't need to leave today. Maybe you need to have a conversation. Maybe you need to establish a boundary. Maybe you need to learn something. Maybe you need to prepare. Maybe you need to build quietly. Or maybe you already know. You just haven't given yourself permission to admit it. If that's where you are, I want you to remember this. You are not required to remain the same person simply because other people are comfortable with who you used to be. You are allowed to grow. You are allowed to change. You are allowed to develop new standards. You are allowed to discover new dreams. And you are allowed to walk into a new room without apologizing for becoming the woman who belongs there. That's marble. Foundation. You know what holds you. That's magnolia, culture. Be intentional about what surrounds you. And that's marigold, presence. Have the courage to occupy the life you're becoming. Maybe the room isn't the problem. Maybe the room simply served its purpose. Maybe it's taught you something. Maybe it's strengthened you. Maybe it introduced you to people you need to meet. Maybe it introduced you to people you needed to meet. Maybe it prepared you for something you couldn't see. And maybe now it's time to take what you learned and carry it somewhere new. You don't have to hate the old room to enter the next one. You simply have to recognize when it's time. So today I leave you with this question. What room have you outgrown? And perhaps an even more important question, what room are you being called to create? Don't be afraid of the answer. Your next season may require a different room, and perhaps it requires a different version of you. This is Marble Magnolia with Dr. Regina Hernandez Smit. I'm Dr. Regina Hernandez Smit. Until next time, stand on your foundation, tend to your culture, and take up presence. And remember, you don't have to stay in a room just because it once gave you a place to belong. Sometimes growth requires space, and sometimes that space is beyond the room you've outgrown.